The Bible is filled with stories that teach profound lessons about life, faith and morality. However, some of these stories are so dark that many avoid mentioning them, especially when it comes to sexual sins. These disturbing accounts are not only descriptions of immoral acts, but records of the devastating consequences that followed these sins. Get ready to learn about 7 biblical stories that show how lust and sexual immorality can destroy lives, families, and even entire cities. What you are about to hear is not only shocking, but a warning of how straying from God's laws can lead to complete ruin. We start with the city most notorious for its moral decay, Sodom, a city where sin and perversion were not only common, but openly celebrated. Sodom was not merely a place of common immorality. It was a den of total corruption, where God's law was ridiculed and the most abominable acts were shamelessly practiced. Life in Sodom revolved around unbridled pleasure with no moral limits. The young were exploited, families were torn apart, and respect for sacred principles had completely vanished. The most emblematic story of Sodom's depravity is the night when 2 angels sent by God visited Lot's house. Upon arriving in the city, they were welcomed by Lot, who insisted that they spend the night in his house, knowing that the streets of Sodom were not safe. He begged, "Don't stay in the square B." But as night fell, Sodom revealed its true face. Men from all over the city, young and old, surrounded Lot's house. They demanded that the visitors be handed over to them, with the intention of committing sexual abuse. It was a terrifying moment that demonstrated the extreme level of perversion that had taken hold of that society. Even in the face of the threat, Lot tried to negotiate with the mob, asking them not to commit such wickedness, but his pleas were ignored and ridiculed. The situation spiraled out of control. And the angels, recognizing the imminent danger, pulled Lot into the house and blinded the men outside. This was the final proof that Sodom had crossed all limits and could not be saved. Before dawn, the angels ordered Lot and his family to leave the city immediately, as destruction was about to occur. On that very same day, fire and brimstone fell from the heavens, completely consuming Sodom and Gomorrah. Everything was destroyed. Houses, inhabitants, and even the surrounding vegetation. It was a severe divine judgment that left an eternal reminder. God does not tolerate sin. And even during the escape, Lot's wife, by disobeying and looking back, was transformed into a pillar of salt, symbolizing that there was no return for those who chose to live in sin. Another equally shocking account is that of Lot's daughters, who, after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, believed that there were no more men in the world to continue their family lineage. Overcome by despair, and with their morality completely distorted by the culture of Sodom, they decided to get their father drunk and commit an unthinkable act. They had relations with him in order to become pregnant and preserve the family line. This disturbing story not only reveals the impact that life in a corrupt society can have on the minds of people, but also shows how despair can lead to desperate acts. The consequences of that act were long-lasting. Lot's daughters gave birth to 2 sons, who became the ancestors of peoples that were enemies of Israel, the Moabites and the Ammonites. These peoples throughout history not only rejected the God of Israel, but also became a constant spiritual and military threat to God's people. The story of Lot's daughters is a reminder of how wrong choices can have repercussions that extend beyond their own generation. Moving forward in the biblical narrative, we find an equally dark episode that occurred during Israel's journey through the wilderness. The chosen people, after being freed from slavery in Egypt, were constantly tested and instructed to follow divine laws. However, in a moment of weakness, many Israelites allowed themselves to be seduced by Moabite women, who enticed them not only into acts of sexual immorality, but also into idolatry. The Moabite women approached in a friendly manner, offering parties and celebrations. But these parties were in fact rituals dedicated to Baal, the pagan fertility god. What began as simple social encounters soon turned into a grave national sin. The men of Israel participated in the rituals and joined the Moabite women, completely disregarding God's commandments. As a consequence, a deadly plague spread throughout the camp, killing thousands of people. It took the extreme courage of Phinehas, grandson of the priest Aaron, to to halt the plague by executing a couple who were openly defying the holiness of God. This episode showed how sin can spread quickly and bring about mass destruction if not contained in time. Also in the Old Testament, we find another terrifying story that illustrates how lust and sexual violence can lead to devastating consequences, the case of the Levite and his concubine in Gibeah. During a journey, the Levite and his companion arrived in the city of Gibeah, belonging to the tribe of Benjamin. They expected to find hospitality, but were ignored by the city's inhabitants, a clear sign of moral decay. An elderly man, also a foreigner, offered shelter to the couple, but the peace of the night was shattered by a mob of perverse men who surrounded the house, demanding that the Levite be handed over to them so that they could abuse him. In a desperate attempt to protect his guest, the old man offered his own daughter and the Levite's concubine, but the mob rejected the offer. However, the Levite, in an act of extreme cowardice, handed his concubine over to those men. The woman was brutally assaulted throughout the night and at dawn was found dead at the door of the house. Outraged, the Levite took the body of his concubine, cut it into 12 pieces, and sent each piece to one of the tribes of Israel demanding justice. The response of the tribes of Israel to the abominable act committed in Gibeah was swift and fierce. Outraged by the brutality of what had occurred and by the indifference of the tribe of Benjamin, which refused to surrender those responsible, the other tribes united to seek justice. The Levites' call resonated in the hearts of all the leaders of Israel, who gathered at Mizpah to decide the fate of Gibeah and its inhabitants. The situation worsened when the Benjaminites, instead of submitting to judgment, chose to protect the guilty and challenge the rest of Israel. The result of this decision was a devastating civil war, Israel divided between the Benjaminites and the other tribes, plunged into a bloody conflict that nearly led to the total extinction of the tribe of Benjamin. The battle was fierce, and in the end only 600 Benjaminite men survived hiding in the mountains. This war not only left a trail of destruction, but also profoundly shook the unity of God's people. The episode of Gibeah remains one of the darkest accounts in the Bible, a warning of how moral depravity can destroy not only individuals but entire communities. But the dark stories involving sexual sins do not stop there. Another disturbing account occurs in the royal house of David, one of the most important kings of Israel. David, although described as a man after God's own heart, faced personal and familial tragedies due to sins that began with acts of lust. The most striking episode is the story of Ammon and Tamar, children of King David. Ammon, David's eldest son and heir to the throne, developed a sick desire for his half-sister, Tamar. This desire turned into an obsession that left him unwell. He knew he could not simply approach her, as Tamar was a princess and, moreover, a virgin, protected by the laws of Israel. Ammon then turned to Jonadab, his cunning cousin, who gave him a perverse piece of advice and asked David to send Tamar to care for him. David, unsuspecting, acceded to Amnon's request. Tamar, concerned about her brother's health, went to his room to prepare a meal for him. However, once they were alone, Ammon revealed his true intentions. Tamar, desperate, tried to resist, begging him not to commit that abominable act. "No, my brother, don't do this madness," she pleaded. But Ammon, overcome by lust, did not listen and raped her. The brutal act not only destroyed Tamar's purity and honor, but also brought terrible consequences for David's household. After consummating the act, Amnon's feelings for Tamar changed drastically. What had once been desire turned into hatred, and he humiliated her by expelling her from his presence. Tamar, emotionally devastated, tore her garments and covered herself in ashes, a symbol of mourning and shame. Absalom, Tamar's brother, upon learning of the incident, took his sister in and began planning his revenge. David, although furious upon learning what had happened, took no action against Ammon, perhaps because he was his firstborn and heir to the throne. This silence from David was the spark that led Absalom to act on his own. 2 years later, during a feast, Absalom ordered his servants to kill Ammon, thus avenging his sister's dishonor. This family tragedy had lasting repercussions. Amnon's death created a rift between David and Absalom, who fled and spent years in exile. When he finally returned, Absalom initiated a rebellion against his own father in an attempt to seize the throne. The ensuing civil war nearly destroyed the kingdom of Israel, and in the end, Absalom was killed, leaving David deeply shaken. This series of events shows how Amnon's sexual sin triggered a chain of tragedies that marked the history of Israel's royal family. Another dark episode in the Bible related to sexual sins occurs in the time of the Judges, when the nation of Israel still had no king. During that period, each tribe lived independently, and the people often strayed from God's commandments, surrendering themselves to idolatry and immorality. One of the most striking episodes of that era is the account of how the Israelites fell into sin with Moabite women during their journey through the desert. Balak, king of Moab, fearing the advance of Israel, hired the prophet Balaam to curse the people of God. However, God prevented Balaam from doing so. Frustrated, Balak found a different way to corrupt Israel. Through seduction, Moabite women were sent to the Israelite camp with the mission of enticing the men into idolatrous rituals that involved practices of sexual immorality. The men of Israel, seduced by the beauty of the women and the promise of pleasure, began participating in these rituals. What began as a simple social interaction soon turned into a grave collective sin. They bowed down before Baal and joined the women in immoral acts, completely disregarding the sacred covenant they had with God. God's wrath was ignited against Israel, and a deadly plague spread through the camp, killing thousands of people. Moses, following divine command, summoned the leaders of the people and ordered that the guilty be executed. Meanwhile, the plague continued to devastate Israel until Phinehas, grandson of Aaron, took drastic action. He grabbed a spear and, upon seeing an Israelite and a Midianite couple openly defying the sanctity of God, pierced them with the weapon, immediately halting the plague. Phinehas's act was seen as a gesture of zeal for the holiness of God, and he was rewarded with a covenant of perpetual peace for his descendants. In total, 24,000 people died because of that sin. This episode serves as a somber reminder of how temptation and lust can lead an entire people to destruction if not firmly resisted. These biblical stories are not merely accounts of ancient times. They serve as timeless warnings about the dangers of sexual immorality and its consequences. Although we live in a different world, temptations remain. And divine principles continue to be relevant. May we learn from these accounts and strive to live according to the values that God has established, avoiding the path of destruction that so many before us have walked. Temptation and sin are recurring themes in the scriptures, and few stories illustrate their consequences as well as that of David and Bathsheba. This episode shows that even a man after God's own heart, such as David, is not immune to human weaknesses. It all began on a quiet afternoon when King David, while walking along the terrace of his palace, spotted Bathsheba bathing. Overcome by lust, David ordered that the woman be brought to the palace, even though he knew she was married to Uriah, one of his most loyal soldiers. The illicit relationship resulted in a pregnancy. And fearing that his sin would be discovered, David tried to cover up the situation. He called Uriah back from the battlefield, hoping that he would spend the night with his wife. But Uriah, out of loyalty to his fellow soldiers, refused to do so while his comrades were still fighting. Frustrated, David made an extreme decision. He sent Uriah back to the battlefield with orders to place him in the front lines, where the fighting was fiercest. Uriah was killed and David took Bathsheba as his wife. Although David managed to hide his sin from men, he could not hide it from God. The prophet Nathan was sent by God to confront him using a parable that exposed the gravity of his actions. Repentant, David acknowledged his mistake and sought divine forgiveness. However, the consequences of his sin were severe. The child he had with Bathsheba died. And a sword never left his house again. This episode serves as a reminder that although God is merciful and forgives the penitent, sin always brings consequences. In addition to David, other leaders of Israel also fell into sin, bringing disgrace to God's people. A notorious example is that of Hophni and Phinehas, the sons of Eli, the high priest. These two men, who should have been examples of purity and holiness, used their position to indulge in lust and corruption. They not only stole from the offerings brought to the tabernacle, but also slept with the women who attended the entrance of the sanctuary. The behavior of Hophni and Phinehas not only dishonored God, but also led the people to despise the sacrifices and drift away from the faith. Eli, although aware of his son's sins, was passive and did not take the necessary measures to correct them. As a result, God pronounced a severe judgment against the house of Eli. During a battle against the Philistines, Hophni and Phinehas were killed, and the Ark of the Covenant was captured. Upon hearing the news, Eli, already elderly, fell from his chair and died. This tragic end shows how spiritual negligence and tolerance of sin can bring disastrous consequences. These biblical accounts teach us that sin not only affects those who commit it, but also has the power to destroy families, communities, and entire nations. Whether through unbridled lust, sexual violence, or spiritual corruption, the sexual sins described in the Bible brought pain, suffering, and destruction. However, we also see in these narratives the mercy of God, who offers forgiveness to those who genuinely repent. If there is one lesson we can take from these stories, it is the importance of remaining steadfast in faith and divine principles. The world may change, temptations may take new forms, but the nature of sin and its consequences remain the same. May we learn from these accounts and strive for a life of holiness, knowing that, although sin brings destruction, God is always willing to give us a new chance when we repent and return to Him. Enjoyed this video? Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss any new content. You won't want to miss it. Until next time.